The vast emptiness of space swallowed HFY's tiny vessel like a grain of sand in an infinite ocean. Stars blinked indifferently as her ship, the Lemaitre, limped through the darkness. HFY's four-fingered hands trembled on the controls, her iridescent scales dulling with each passing moment. "Come on, come on," she hissed through clenched teeth, her normally melodious voice strained with desperation. The ship's alarms blared, a cacophony of danger and imminent failure. It had all happened so fast. One moment, she was on a routine biosampling mission in the Orion Arm. The next, chaos. A micrometeorite storm had shredded her shields like paper, puncturing the hull in a dozen places. The Lemaitre's advanced self-repair systems were working overtime, but it wasn't enough. HFY's eyes darted frantically across the NAV screen. There has to be something, anything. Her gaze locked onto a faint signal. A station? A outpost? She didn't care. It was her only hope. With a grunt of effort, she wrenched the controls, sending the Lemaitre into a sharp turn. Pain lanced through her side. One of the hull breaches had caught her with a spray of superheated plasma. The wound throbbed, a constant reminder of her predicament. The mystery signal grew stronger. HFY allowed herself a moment of hope. Then, without warning, the main power core sputtered and died. No, not now, not now. Emergency lights bathed the cockpit in an eerie red glow. The Lemaitre was now little more than a tin can hurtling through space. HFY's breath came in ragged gasps as she fought to maintain control. The signal source loomed ahead, a decrepit space station, its paint peeling and antennae askew. It was far from pretty, but to HFY, it was the most beautiful sight in the universe. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the alarms. "Please let there be someone there. Anyone." The Lemaitre streaked towards the station, trailing debris and leaking fuel. HFY's vision blurred, the pain and stress taking their toll. With the last of her strength, she aimed for what looked like a docking bay. Crash. The impact sent HFY flying from her seat. Her head slammed against a bulkhead, and darkness consumed her. As consciousness slipped away, one final, desperate thought echoed in her mind. "Help me." The Lemaitre lay silent and broken, lodged in the maw of the ancient station. Sparks danced across its hull, the only sign of life in the cold, indifferent void of space. Consciousness returned to HFY in waves of pain and confusion. Her eyes fluttered open, struggling to focus in the dim emergency lighting of her ruined ship. Every breath sent daggers of agony through her side. NNGH, system, status. She croaked, her translator implant converting her native clicks and whistles into standard galactic common. Silence. The Lemaitre's AI was offline. HFY was alone. With a groan, she pushed herself up, scales scraping against the twisted metal of the cockpit floor. The view screen was a spiderweb of cracks, offering only a fragmented glimpse of her surroundings. She had made it inside the station, but at what cost? "Move," HFY hissed to herself. "Move or you're dead." Gritting her teeth against the pain, she dragged herself towards the emergency hatch. The mechanism was jammed, forcing her to slam her shoulder against it repeatedly. With a screech of protesting metal, it finally gave way. HFY tumbled out onto the cold, unforgiving floor of the station's docking bay. The air was stale, tinged with the scent of old lubricants and decaying plastics. Dim, flickering lights cast long shadows across abandoned machinery and docking clamps. "Hello," she called out, her voice echoing in the cavernous space. "Is anyone there? I need help." Silence was her only answer. Fighting back a wave of despair, HFY forced herself to her feet. She had to find help, or at least supplies to treat her injuries. One step at a time, she made her way towards a set of airlock doors at the far end of the bay. The station's corridors were a maze of neglect. Dust coated every surface, disturbed only by HFY's faltering footsteps. Signs in a dozen alien languages pointed to long-abandoned facilities. Crew quarters, mess hall, medical bay. Medical bay. That was what she needed. Zuixera's strength was fading fast. The wound in her side had reopened, leaving a trail of luminescent ichor in her wake. Her vision swam, the corridor seeming to stretch and distort before her eyes. Just a little further, she gasped, using the wall for support. The medical bay doors loomed ahead, sealed tight. Zuixera's heart sank. If it was locked, she was doomed. With trembling hands, she reached for the control panel. To her shock and relief, it lit up at her touch. The doors slid open with a hiss, revealing a room that seemed frozen in time. Dust-covered equipment lined the walls, and exam tables stood silent vigil in the center. Zuixera stumbled inside, her eyes desperately scanning for anything useful. Most of the equipment was alien to her, designed for species she couldn't even name. But there, in a cabinet near the back, she spotted something familiar, a universal medkit. With the last of her strength, she lunged for it. Her fingers had just brushed the handle when her legs gave out. Zuixera crashed to the floor, the impact sending a fresh wave of agony through her battered body. "No!" she whimpered, reaching feebly for the medkit now just out of reach. "Please, I don't want to die here." As darkness began to close in around her, Zuixera's fading consciousness registered a sound. Footsteps? No, it couldn't be. This place was abandoned, forgotten by the galaxy. The last thing she saw before blackness claimed her was a pair of boots stepping into view. A voice, speaking a language her failing translator couldn't process. And then, nothing. Consciousness returned slowly, dragging Zuixera from the depths of oblivion. The first thing she noticed was the absence of pain. A dull ache had replaced the searing agony in her side. The second was the steady beep of unfamiliar medical equipment. Her eyes snapped open, immediately assaulted by harsh white light. Zuixera hissed, instinctively trying to raise an arm to shield herself. To her shock, she found her limbs restrained. Panic surged through her. Had she been captured? Experimented on? Her heart raced, sending a fresh wave of pain through her body. "Whoa, easy there," a voice called out. It was oddly soothing, despite the alien tone. "You're safe. I promise." A figure stepped into view, blocking the worst of the light. Zuixera blinked rapidly, her third eyelid flickering as she tried to focus. What she saw nearly stopped her heart. It was a human. Zuixera had heard of humans, of course. What spacefaring species hadn't? But she'd never seen one up close. This specimen was not what she expected. He was tall and lean, with a mop of dark fur atop its head. 2 arms, 2 legs, just like in the vids. But those eyes, they were warm, filled with concern. "Can you understand me?" the human asked, speaking slowly and clearly. Zuixera's translator kicked in, the implant finally recovering from the crash. "Why, yes," she managed to croak out. Where am I?" The human's face split into what Zuixera recognized as a smile. "You're in the medical bay of Outpost 87. Well, what's left of it? I'm Dr. Eli Chun, and I've been patching you up for the past 3 days. 3 days? Zuixera's mind reeled. She'd been unconscious for that long? The restraints, Dr. Chen continued, noticing her distress, are just a precaution. You were thrashing about quite a bit earlier. Mind if I remove them? Zuixera nodded weakly. As the human worked to undo the straps, she found her voice again. Why are you helping me? Dr. Chen paused, looking genuinely puzzled. Why wouldn't I? You were injured and alone. What kind of doctor, what kind of person would I be if I just left you there? The restraints fell away, and Zuixera slowly pushed herself up to a sitting position. She winced, expecting pain, but found only a dull twinge. Looking down, she saw her wound had been expertly treated and bandaged. Thank you, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I am Zuixera of the Lumini. I thought I was going to die here. Dr. Chin's smile returned, softer this time. Well, Zuixera of the Lumini, I'm glad I could prove you wrong. Now, how about we get some food in you? I've been force-feeding you nutrient paste, but I bet you're ready for something a bit more substantial. As if on cue, Zoexera's stomach growled loudly. She felt her scales flush with embarrassment, but Dr. Chan just laughed. "I'll take that as a yes. Sit tight. I'll be right back." As the human turned to leave, Zoexera found herself staring at his retreating form. Of all the scenarios she had imagined when she crashed on this derelict station, being saved by a lone human doctor hadn't even crossed her mind. For the first time since the disaster, Zoexera allowed herself to feel something dangerously close to hope. Perhaps she would survive this ordeal after all. Little did she know, her adventure was only just beginning. The days that followed were a blur of recovery and revelation for Zoexera. Dr. Chan Eli, as he insisted she call him, proved to be a capable physician despite his limited experience with lumini physiology. "So, your species has 3 stomachs?" Eli asked, his eyes wide with fascination as he examined a holographic scan of Zoexera's internal organs. Zoexera chittered, a sound her translator rendered as laughter. "Yes, and you humans only have one. How do you even function?" Their conversations often took this turn, each marveling at the other's alien nature. But for all their differences, Zoexera found herself warming to the human's presence. His dedication to her recovery was unexpected. One morning, time being a relative concept on the abandoned station, Zoexera finally broached the subject that had been nagging at her. "Eli," she began, her voice hesitant, "why are you here? Alone on this graveyard of a station?" The human's usually cheerful demeanor darkened. He was silent for a long moment, busying himself with checking her vitals. "I suppose you could say I'm in exile," he finally said, his voice low. "There was an outbreak on my last assignment. A lot of people died. I couldn't save them all." Zoexera felt a pang of empathy. "But surely that wasn't your fault? Outbreaks happen, even with advanced medicine." Eli's laugh was bitter. "Try telling that to the bureaucrats. They needed a scapegoat, and well, here I am, assigned to the ass end of nowhere, monitoring a station that hasn't seen regular traffic in decades." His words hung heavy in the air. Zoexera reached out, hesitantly placing a scaled hand on his arm. Eli looked up, surprise evident in his eyes. "I'm sorry," she said simply. "That must be lonely." Something passed between them in that moment, a shared understanding, perhaps, or maybe just the recognition of 2 souls adrift in the vast emptiness of space. The moment was shattered by a sudden, blaring alarm. Eli jumped to his feet, cursing. "What is it?" Zoexera asked, her heart's racing. "What's happening?" "Proximity alert," Eli growled, rushing to a nearby console. "Something big just dropped out of FTL nearby, and it's heading straight for us." Zoexera felt her blood run cold. "Eli, my people, they must have tracked my distress signal, but if they find me here, with you?" The human turned, his face grim. What aren't you telling me, Zoexera?" She took a deep breath, steeling herself. "My people, we're not exactly on good terms with humans. If they find you here, they'll assume you've taken me prisoner. They'll kill you, Eli." Eli's face hardened with determination. "Well then, we'd better come up with a plan and fast, because that ship will be here in less than an hour." As alarms continued to blare around them, Zoexera realized that her ordeal was far from over. The real test was yet to come, and the life of the human who had saved her now hung in the balance. The days that followed were a blur of recovery and revelation for Zoexera. Dr. Chan Eli, as he insisted she call him, proved to be a capable physician despite his limited experience with lumini physiology. "So, your species has 3 stomachs?" Eli asked, his eyes wide with fascination as he examined a holographic scan of Zoexera's internal organs. Zoexera chittered, a sound her translator rendered as laughter. "Yes, and you humans only have one. How do you even function?" Their conversations often took this turn, each marveling at the other's alien nature. But for all their differences, Zoexera found herself warming to the human's presence. His dedication to her recovery was unexpected. One morning, time being a relative concept on the abandoned station, Zoexera finally broached the subject that had been nagging at her. Eli, she began, her voice hesitant. Why are you here? Alone on this graveyard of a station? The human's usually cheerful demeanor darkened. He was silent for a long moment, busying himself with checking her vitals. I suppose you could say I'm in exile, he finally said, his voice low. There was an outbreak on my last assignment. A lot of people died. I couldn't save them all. ZYXera felt a pang of empathy. But surely that wasn't your fault? Outbreaks happen, even with advanced medicine. Eli's laugh was bitter. Try telling that to the bureaucrats. They needed a scapegoat, and well, here I am. Assigned to the ass end of nowhere, monitoring a station that hasn't seen regular traffic in decades. His words hung heavy in the air. ZYXera reached out, hesitantly placing a scaled hand on his arm. Eli looked up, surprise evident in his eyes. I'm sorry, she said simply. That must be lonely. Something passed between them in that moment. A shared understanding, perhaps, or maybe just the recognition of two souls adrift in the vast emptiness of space. The moment was shattered by a sudden, blaring alarm. Eli jumped to his feet, cursing. What is it? ZYXera asked, her heart's racing. What's happening? Proximity alert, Eli growled, rushing to a nearby console. Something big just dropped out of FTL nearby, and it's heading straight for us. ZYXera felt her blood run cold. Eli, my people, they must have tracked my distress signal, but if they find me here, with you? The human turned, his face grim. What aren't you telling me, ZYXera? She took a deep breath, steeling herself. My people, we're not exactly on good terms with humans. If they find you here, they'll assume you've taken me prisoner. They'll kill you, Eli. Eli's face hardened with determination. Well then, we'd better come up with a plan and fast, because that ship will be here in less than an hour. As alarms continued to blare around them, ZYXera realized that her ordeal was far from over. The real test was yet to come, and the life of the human who had saved her now hung in the balance. Time seemed to stretch and compress as Eli and ZYXera raced against the clock. The human's fingers flew across the station's archaic control panels, bringing long-dormant systems back to life. If we can mask your biosignature, Eli muttered, more to himself than to ZYXera, maybe we can convince them you're not here. ZYXera paced nervously, her claws clicking against the metal floor. It won't work, she hissed. The Lumini are relentless. They'll tear this station apart looking for me. Eli spun in his chair, fixing her with an intense gaze. Then we need to give them a reason to leave. ZYXera, what exactly is your position among your people? Why are they so determined to find you? She hesitated, scales rippling with discomfort. I'm not just a biosampler. I'm the daughter of High Matriarch ZYX Laura. My mission was classified. If I don't return, they'll assume humans captured or killed you, Eli finished, his face paling, potentially sparking an interspecies incident. Shit. The proximity alarms grew louder, more insistent. ZYXera's hearts raced. She couldn't let Eli suffer for helping her. An idea began to form, desperate, dangerous, but possibly their only hope. Eli, she said, her voice trembling, I need you to hurt me. The human recoiled as if struck. What? ZYXera? No. I'm a doctor. I took an oath to do no harm. Listen to me. ZYXera grabbed his shoulders, her claws digging in slightly. If I appear injured, barely alive, I can convince them that you saved me. That humans aren't the monsters my people believe them to be. Eli shook his head vehemently. There has to be another way. I can't just dash. His words were cut off by a bone-shaking boom that reverberated through the station. The Lumini ship had docked. We're out of time, ZYXera whispered. Eli's face was a mask of conflict, but she saw the moment resolve hardened in his eyes. Okay, he said, his voice barely audible. What do we do? What followed was a frantic, almost choreographed dance of controlled harm. Eli's medical knowledge allowed him to create the appearance of grave injury without causing lasting damage. ZYXera bit back screams as he applied carefully calibrated electrical shocks, creating convincing burn patterns across her scales. As the sound of armored footsteps echoed down the corridor, Eli laid Zyxera on a medical bed, surrounded by beeping equipment. He stepped back, his hands shaking. "I'm so sorry," he whispered. Zyxera managed a weak smile. "Don't be. You saved my life. Twice now." The doors burst open. Lumini soldiers poured in, weapons raised. Their faceplates reflected Eli's terrified expression as he raised his hands in surrender. A tall figure pushed through the soldiers. Matriarch Zyxera herself, her scales shimmering with barely contained rage. "Step away from my daughter, human," she roared. Eli stumbled back. Zyxera saw her chance. With a groan of genuine pain, she lifted her head. "Mother," she croaked. "Don't." "He saved me. The human doctor saved me." The matriarch froze, her gaze darting between Zyxera and Eli. Confusion warred with ingrained prejudice on her face. "Explain," she demanded. And so, Zyxera did. She wove a tale of her crash, her desperate search for help, and Eli's selfless care. With each word, she saw the tension in the room shift. The soldiers lowered their weapons, ever so slightly. The matriarch's posture softened. As Zyxera finished her story, silence fell. All eyes turned to the matriarch. The fate of both Eli and potentially human Lumini relations hung in the balance. Zyxera stepped forward, her eyes locked on Eli. The human stood his ground, chin raised defiantly despite his fear. "You," the matriarch said, her voice low and controlled. "You saved my daughter when you had no obligation to do so?" Eli swallowed hard. "I'm a doctor," he said simply. "It's what I do." For a long moment, no one moved. Then, to everyone's shock, Matriarch Zyxera inclined her head, a gesture of deep respect among the Lumini. "Perhaps," she said slowly, "we have misjudged your kind, human." As the tension in the room finally broke, Zyxera let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. They had done it. Against all odds, they had bridged the gap between their species, if only for this moment. But as she caught Eli's eye, seeing the relief in something else, something deeper, reflected there, Zyxera realized their journey was far from over. This was just the beginning. The days that followed were a whirlwind of diplomacy and medical examinations. Matriarch Zyxera, impressed by Eli's care of her daughter, had declared him an honorary guest of the Lumini. The abandoned station became a hive of activity as more Lumini arrived, turning it into an impromptu neutral ground for discussions. Zyxera found herself caught between two worlds. Her injuries, though largely fabricated, still required some genuine recovery time. This gave her ample opportunity to observe the tentative interactions between her people and Eli. One evening, as the station's ancient chronometers ticked over to what passed for night, Zyxera found Eli alone in the medical bay. He was hunched over a console, muttering to himself. "Eli," she called softly, "are you all right?" The human started, then offered a tired smile. "Zyxera, shouldn't you be resting?" She chittered in amusement. "I've rested enough. What are you working on so late?" Eli hesitated, then gestured for her to come closer. On the screen was a complex molecular structure that Zyxera didn't recognize. "This is why I was really out here," Eli said, his voice low. Before the incident that got me exiled. I was working on a cure for a disease that's been ravaging human colonies on the frontier. Nexus fever." Zyxera's scales rippled in surprise. "I've heard of that. It's devastating." Eli nodded grimly. "The outbreak I couldn't stop. It was Nexus fever. I was so close to a cure, but..." He trailed off, lost in painful memories. Without thinking, Zyxera placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. Eli looked up, startled by the contact. "Tell me about it," she said softly. "Maybe I can help." And so, through the artificial night, they worked. Eli explained the intricacies of human biochemistry, while Zyxera offered insights from her people's advanced biological sciences. It was a dance of minds, each filling in the gaps in the other's knowledge. As the station's lights began to simulate dawn, Eli let out a whoop of joy that made ZYXera jump. "That's IT!" he cried, pointing at the screen. "Do you see? The polysaccharide chain. If we modify it like this?" ZYXera leaned in, her eyes widening as she grasped the implications. "Eli, this could work. This could actually—" Their eyes met, a moment of shared triumph and understanding passing between them. Without warning, Eli pulled ZYXera into a hug. She stiffened for a moment and used to such physical contact before relaxing into the embrace. "We did it," Eli whispered. "We actually did it." As they separated, both somewhat embarrassed, the medical bay doors slid open. Matriarch ZYXLora entered, her regal bearing somewhat diminished by obvious fatigue. "Daughter," she said, then nodded respectfully to Eli. "Doctor, I hope I'm not interrupting." ZYXera felt her scales flush, but Eli stepped forward eagerly. "Matriarch, we've made a breakthrough. A cure for Nexus fever." "But—" he hesitated, looking at ZYXera. "We couldn't have done it without cooperation. Human and Lumini knowledge, working together." The matriarch was silent for a long moment, her gaze moving between the two of them. Finally, she spoke. "Perhaps this is a sign," she said slowly. "A sign that isolation has served neither of our species well. Dr. Chun, I would like to formally invite you to continue your work on Lumini Prime, with full access to our medical facilities." Eli's jaw dropped. ZYXera felt a surge of excitement, quickly followed by an unexpected pang of something else. Would Eli leave? Would she see him again? I'm honored, matriarch," Eli stammered. "But what about—" He gestured vaguely, encompassing the station and his exile. ZYXLora waved a dismissive hand. "I will speak with your superiors. A mind like yours should not be wasted in isolation. Besides," and here her mandibles clicked in what ZYXera recognized as a sly smile, "I believe my daughter would be most disappointed if you were to refuse." ZYXera felt her scales flush hot with embarrassment. "Mother!" But as she caught Eli's eye, saw the hope and excitement there, she couldn't help but feel a thrill of anticipation. Whatever came next, they would face it together, human and Lumini, bridging the gap between their worlds. "Well, Dr. Chun," the matriarch prompted, "what say you?" Eli looked at ZYXera, a question in his eyes. She nodded, almost imperceptibly. "I say," Eli replied, a grin spreading across his face. "When do we start?" As discussions began in earnest, ZYXera realized that her crashed ship had led to far more than just her own rescue. It had opened the door to a new era of cooperation and understanding between their species. And perhaps, though she hardly dared to admit it to herself, something more between her and the human doctor who had saved her life. The adventure, it seemed, was only just beginning. The once abandoned station hummed with activity as final preparations were made for departure. Lumini technicians worked alongside the few human crew members who had arrived to assist Eli, their initial wariness giving way to cautious curiosity. ZYXera stood at a viewport, watching as her people's ships maneuvered in the star-studded void. Her reflection stared back at her, scales gleaming with health, but eyes troubled. "Credit for your thoughts?" Eli's voice startled her from her reverie. She turned to find him leaning against the bulkhead, a lopsided grin on his face. "I believe the human phrase is penny for your thoughts," ZYXera corrected, her mandibles clicking in amusement. Eli chuckled. But your thoughts are worth far more than a penny, ZYXera." She felt her scales flush at the compliment. Over the past weeks, as they had worked together on refining the Nexus fever cure, ZYXera had found herself increasingly aware of the human's presence. His quick mind, his dedication, his strange alien features that she now found oddly appealing. "I was just thinking," she said slowly, "about how much has changed. A few cycles ago, our peoples were on the brink of conflict. And now we're on the brink of something else entirely," Eli finished. He stepped closer, his expression growing serious. "ZYXera, there's something I need to tell you." Her hearts began to race. "Yes?" Eli took a deep breath. I've been offered a position at the Galactic Medical Council. They want me to present our findings on the Nexus fever cure to oversee its distribution to affected colonies. ZYXera felt as if the artificial gravity had suddenly failed. But what about coming to Lumini Prime? Working in our facilities? That's just it, Eli said, running a hand through his hair in a gesture ZYXera had come to recognize as nervousness. The council, they want a Lumini representative too. Someone who understands both the science and the importance of interspecies cooperation. Realization dawned. You mean me? Eli nodded. You'd be perfect for it, ZYXera, but I know it's a lot to ask. Leaving your homeworld, your people. My mother would never allow it, ZYXera said, her voice barely a whisper. As if summoned by her words, the medical bay doors slid open. Matriarch ZYXLora entered, her regal bearing commanding instant attention. Allow what precisely? She asked, her tone deceptively mild. Eli straightened, clearly steeling himself. Matriarch, I was just informing ZYXera of an opportunity with the Galactic Medical Council. They're interested in having her as a representative for the Lumini to help oversee the distribution of the Nexus fever cure. ZYXera held her breath, waiting for her mother's inevitable refusal. To her shock, the matriarch simply nodded. Yes, I'm aware of the offer. I received the communique this morning. You did? ZYXera stammered. But I thought... The matriarch's expression softened, ever so slightly. You thought I would forbid it? My daughter, you have already proven yourself capable of far more than I ever imagined. Your work here, with Dr. Chun, has opened doors our people have long kept shut. ZYXera felt dizzy with possibility. Then you're saying... I'm saying, ZYXLora continued, that the choice is yours. Stay on Lumini Prime, or represent our people on the galactic stage. Both paths have merit. Both will shape the future of our species. The weight of the decision pressed down on ZYXera. She looked at Eli, saw the hope in his eyes, but also the determination to support whatever choice she made. I need time to think, she finally managed. The matriarch nodded. Of course, but not too much time. We depart for Lumini Prime in 12 hours. Your decision must be made by then. With that, she turned and left, leaving ZYXera and Eli alone once more. ZYXera, Eli said softly, whatever you choose, I want you to know dash. She held up a hand, stopping him. Please, Eli. I can't. I need to do this on my own. To be sure. Understanding filled his eyes. He nodded, then hesitantly reached out, squeezing her hand gently before leaving her alone with her thoughts. ZYXera turned back to the viewport, her reflection now overlaid with the stars beyond. In 12 hours, she would have to choose between duty to her people and the promise of something new. Between the familiar and the unknown. Between her past and a future she had never dared to imagine. As the stars wheeled slowly past, ZYXera closed her eyes, searching her hearts for the answer.